I find myself like thinking all the time, you know, both of us were raised not observant. We became observant in our 20s. We had similar backgrounds. We were doing doctorates in English literature. We were studying with good people. I studied with Northrop Frye. You studied with yeah, right. And great Miltonists and stuff, you know. And so we were a certain profile. And then I don't even know how to put it. Like, we did this thing. We did this rupture in our lives. And it's a question now, many years later, how does that narrative fit into who we are now, right? I guess what I'm interested from you is do you look at your life as the narratives are somehow separate, or you can see the thread between the decision you made a long time ago to become a religious Jew and how you feel about that now, or does it seem more broken up?
You know, a well-known psychotherapist, Adam Phillips, says that adulthood is when you realize you're no longer living a charmed life. And I think that means really you think at a certain point that the story that you're telling is somehow going to be a coherent fiction or a coherent narrative. And then at a certain point, it ceases to be that. Now, I don't think we experienced that as a rupture at the time. Retroactively, we see, wow, what a rupture and what an interruption. And I think a lot about narrative because that's what I do, study narratives. And I think about the way in which one would try to go back to the past and appropriate it, but I still haven't been able to do it. I still haven't been able to take that story and see it as part of my current story. I mean, certainly partially, obviously, but there's some sense that there definitely is still that rupture.
Do you remember what you were thinking? Like, here you are. How old are you? 20, 19, 21?
No, 29.
29.
Right.
Oh, that's so older.
Well,
you finished graduate school.
In the middle of graduate school.
In the middle of graduate school, and all of a sudden now, here you are, black hat, black suit.
Right. It wasn't all of a sudden. It took time. I mean, we went. It's we always, my wife and I. We went through various institutions, but certainly at the end, we ended up in that black hat and that black suit.
And were you conscious all the time as you're going through it? Like, I'm doing this thing. I'm doing more of this thing.
Sure. I mean, and we've mentioned in the past that we went into this world, and very often that there was this kind of inside talk, which was characterized in many ways by whatever, homophobia, racism, sexism. And I remember hearing it at the time. I remember, thinking it's like my Uncle Morty from the Five Towns, right? And in a way that was a safe way of bracketing it. It's just kind of a generational thing. But these people were not necessarily of, Uncle Morty who was 70 or 80 years old. These were 40 or 50-year-old people. So what I thought at the time really is that, you can't answer all your questions at once. I mean, that was my line then, you have to bracket certain questions. And I think that's a reasonable thing in life, that there are certain questions that if you dwell on them, it doesn't allow you to go forward.
Wait, so do you mean
bracketing
meaning how can I be joining Orthodox Judaism when they're racist and homophobic?
Right, did he just say Schwarzer for the 97th time?
Right. How can I be part of this club?
Right, so I would bracket that. I felt I felt maybe selfishly I was getting certain skills from them, although I did use them as role models as well, that's for sure. So I kind of bracketed that out of them.
So it's a complicated intertwining, right? Because there's nobility there. There's beauty, there's passion, there's all the things one would aspire to, mixed with some ugliness and, well, like life, really.
Well, but a kind of sociological ugliness which you just think is gratuitous and unnecessary. Right? Why does this have to be?
Why does it have to be? In other words, what do you think it comes from?
What is the sociology of the Haredi world, the ultra-Orthodox world in Israel, such that they're racist? Well, just fear of the others, essentially, meaning, and that's become obviously more extreme over the past couple of decades. I also think when telling our story or thinking about telling our story, when we began this new thing, as you put it, things were very different, meaning the Orthodox world or the ultra-Orthodox world had not been pushed into a corner by technology. Its anxieties about modernity are much, much more extreme right now. So I think of the Haredi world now, in which my kids, some of them, or to certain extent, all of them live and breathe, and it's much, much more liberal than it was 25 years ago, much more extreme than it was, when we became from.
Because of modernity is encroaching.
Well, it's always been an issue. Right. Ultra-Orthodoxy has always been a function of modernity, as much as reform is a function of modernity. Right.
So, the technology is obviously a game changer as well.
Right.
It makes everybody frightened.
Right. I remember, like a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, iPhones, smartphones were absolutely forbidden in the ultra-Orthodox world. That fight has been lost, meaning they don't even fight it anymore. Everybody has cell phones.
Right.
Maybe
Right.
10 or 15% of the people don't.
Right.
But I think the rupture that you're describing, I went from saying you should bracket the questions, and then I kind of flipped and I said, sometimes there are questions that are urgent, you have to ask them.
Yeah.
And I think that's really when I turned kind of away from that world, or pulled away from that world.
Was there ever a point where you said it's really the disparity is too much, the rupture is too great, my loss of identity is too great, I don't want to do this life anymore? It's not me, it's not Bill, it's somebody else. I put it on for a while, but I'm taking it off now.
I think the thing about the ultra-Orthodox world that bugged me the most was that it had a very simplistic idea of what the self actually is. And I think part of me still is that world. And I live in Bayit Vagan, which is a very religious community. And we sometimes joke about it. I have a kind of a fortress. We live on the top floor in a building, and our lives really revolve around that architectural space. But having said that, there's certain things I really like about living there. I like the synagogues there, I like the tefillah there. My family functions beautifully there. I think the thing about the ultra-Orthodox world is, though, it doesn't tolerate the idea that people fulfill different kinds of needs in different kinds of spheres. And or perhaps that's the solution that I came to. And maybe at some point I felt like I have to change this. But I think the way it's become easier to live with myself is to understand that people are parts of different stories.
Yeah, that's true. In some ways it's harder to do what you did, which is not to make a clean break, but to do this kind of gradual evolution within the structure.
Right. I think there's a tendency to in modernity in general, I'm sure you'll agree with me, to go from extreme to extreme. So you have the Choser b'Tshuva, the person who's a Baal Tshuva, and then they have this rupture experience. I'm sure you know 10 stories like I know 10 stories, and then they flip, right? So it's kind of a move between, on the one hand, embracing authority, which obviously in some sense that's what we did, and on the other hand, embracing this kind of liberty. And what I'm trying to do, and I think this is the effort, is not necessarily to find a middle way, because I'm always bored by that, but to kind of live with both extremes.
Right.
And that's really what we want, is to live with both extremes, because the middle is like, who wants that?
There's a lot of psychic pressure to hold the dissonance, though. Even though I agree with you, like you want both, you want the passion on both ends, but I don't even know. People say, oh, you integrate, you balance. Those are fancy modern words. I don't actually think that exists.
Those are apologetic words.
I don't think I'm integrated. I don't think it's like quote unquote balanced. I think I'm just like, there's 3 balls in the air. I have 2 hands. Let's see how long we can do it without getting exhausted.
The Bar Ilan magazine that comes out every month did a story on me, and I was a picture of me on the front cover, and the caption was "The Unified Torah Vision of William Kolbrener." I think, oh, really?
Which word it were. There's this irony, right? You're running away, trying to find your identity.
Right.
You just keep running. I remember telling somebody, people always have these stock questions about your background. So what about you? And I said, well, I rebelled, and then I rebelled against my rebellion. That's the story, So you make this jump out of your background, and then you think, uh-oh.
Well, because you don't lose your critical facilities.
Right.
And I think there was something, I hate using the idealistic terms that you used before, the beautiful, the noble, but I guess that's what it was. There was something kind of hypnotic about that world. Yeah. Although I think for you and me, it wasn't so much that. It was really the learning.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You asked, I became religious in graduate school, and that's not an accident, you too also, right? Because you start to see the insufficiency of the critical discourses of the academy, which are claiming to do a lot of things about truth, about community, about ethics. And you see they really, although they pretend to be doing these things, they really fail at them. Right. And at least in the religious world, there is some impulse to try to integrate the cognitive and the experiential, or the intellectual and the lived.
Right. The irony for me was that I was studying English literature, and you're studying theory in the 80s. Right. So there's Derrida, and the whole school there. And they're deconstructing truth. And part of the appeal of Judaism is that the message, the rather overt message, is we're not dealing with things that get destabilized in 2 seconds. We're dealing with a long-standing kind of eternal tradition that's divinely based. And so there's this background word. The background word is truth. Like, in in literature, you're kind of jazzing around, but here, the buck stops here. And I think the biggest disappointment for me was that that was false. In other words,
in what sense?
I don't really feel that it is a community, let's put it that way, that's organized around truth. It's a community that's organized around living. And maybe my expectations were completely out of sync with what you should expect from communities. But, you know, many real questions, and it started right at the beginning, like when I was at yeshiva, and I was asking questions about text and questions about God and questions about how can this be so?
You were asking questions about God in yeshiva? They didn't throw you out?
No, they just gave me, well, if I realized the absurdity of asking such questions, I never would have, because nobody knows anything about metaphysics. But, you know, that's what I wanted to talk about. And
well, the guide for the perplexed is you don't find that on yeshiva shelves.
No,
right?
You don't. That I got to later, and that was, you know, helpful and not helpful at the same time. But I think that I went in specifically rebelling against a kind of decenteredness of my whole life. Everything was kind of up for grabs, and this is not going to be up for grabs.
I see.
You know, and funnily, part of it took. So I still do the things I did, right? In other words, and I still like them, right? Keeping Shabbat and all of the things that sort of structure religious life. But underneath it, there's this feeling that the rhetoric wasn't matched by the reality, that we're not.
You have a certain kind of prophetic sensibility, meaning the clarity of truth of. I just don't have that. I mean, I just think about your story, and for me, it's that in a way, and this is putting it maybe in over-exaggerated terms, I felt that the instability of my own life was kind of matched in the Jewish world. That is, I was looking for, I was like you in graduate school and thinking a lot about interpretation and community and all those things, and thinking a lot about the possibility of diverse interpretations existing in one community, in one person. And of course, you know, there's all this theoretical stuff in the academy which argues for that. But then when I came to Judaism, we were talking about learning. For me, the Talmud was a reflection exactly of that. And being able to embrace some conception of truth, like I see now, right now, your temperament is much more, in its pure form, prophetic, and I'm much more, in a way, rabbinic. I mean, we both have both aspects, obviously, but the rabbinic sense of seeing multiplicity, right? I mean, the Talmud obviously be just this collections of disputes. So for me, when I found that there, inside a religious tradition, I just thought, wow, right? I mean, inside, and also, as you're saying, inside within a context in which community was emphasized. And as you said, we've both had our falling outs, or at least our disappointments with the way community actually runs in the Jewish world.
When I think about it, I think about certain things that are very lowbrow, that are so much a part of me, that I could never figure out, how does this fit here? I still can't.
Like what?
Rock and roll, right? So you tell people that, you know, you like rock and roll, and they think like you turn on the radio occasionally. And I can't quite get across that I breathe music, right? I breathe music, not just rock and roll, classical music, whatever it is, but there's something there that's so intrinsic to my sense of identity and joy and being. And, you know, if you go to shul, you know, when people talk about music, you know, they're talking about something quite different than what I have in mind. And I know it's a small example, but I can't quite get across. And the other thing is, it seems just so discordant to say, no, like, I'm a huge Sex Pistols fan. You know, I love, you know, Public Image, and I love The Clash, and I love, you know, even Lowbrow. I love AC/DC and Motorhead and all these bands, right? And I like it loud, and I like it moving. And it just seems, you know, when I see it through the eyes of my co-religionists, it's like exotic at best and kind of Proust at worst. I don't know how to translate Proust. Like, you know, unbecoming, kind of quasi-disgusting.
Our whole lives are unbecoming in a certain way, right?
How so?
I mean, I'm thinking it from the point of view of the religious community, the very religious community in which I live. I mean, you know, in which I'm a university professor, and I'm not ever treated in any kind of disparaging way. I mean, certainly the opposite, but I think there is that sense, this is strange.
Right. They don't know what you do, I think.
Yeah, I don't think they know what I do. There's a guy in the shul who gives these very mystical shiurim. It's an enormous Talmud Chacham, but at the last, a very wise and knowledgeable person. And then he always goes into this realm of kind of mystical, really gobbledygook at the end, you know, philosophy. And I always am tempted to ask him, have you ever actually tried to read Descartes or Spinoza? It would be actually good for the way you think, right? It would help you, you know, to be more disciplined. But going back to what you were saying before, the other night I was in the car and my kids went out to the drugstore maybe to pick something up, and when they came back, I had already the music on the level that I listened to it, and my 19-year-old daughter said to me, she said, "Abba, we have a problem," because the music was so loud coming out of the car, right? I don't know. I mean, for me also, but why for you is it problematic? Meaning, it's something that is part of me. What does it have to be part of you that other people acknowledge or recognize?
No, it's not internally problematic, and I don't need it to be acknowledged. Actually, what it creates is it creates an anxiety in me. It's an internal contradiction. It's not nobody's saying anything. Nobody even knows anything.
It's like when I go back into my neighborhood, I'm always careful because I listen to music, which I think is at a normal volume, but really, really loud. Right. So when I go back to the neighborhood, I'm always careful to turn it lower.
Yeah. No, a lot of the tensions are internal. You know, it's my feeling of how can I be this and how can I be that? How can I be this person who you know, reads this poetry, reads the philosophy that you want this other fellow to read, and not just reads it, but likes it. I remember when I was in yeshiva in the outreach world, what they do is...
You were
I was at Esha Torah in 1983. 1983,
the belly of the beast.
Well, it was messianic. I find that people have very sort of extreme takes on the place. I met some really nice people there. It certainly got me started learning Torah, which is fabulous.
But that part has to always be emphasized.
Yeah, for sure.
That we are immersed in languages that give our lives a certain kind of thickness, which my friends in America can't imagine.
Yeah, no,
and they already begin a little bit to envy because they see parts of it.
Thumbs up.
Right?
Absolutely thumbs up. Not just that. I like the word thickness because I feel like my life is thick in that way. The you know, the ritual, the committed life that I still live, right, halachically, with my family is one that I wouldn't give up. And after all, there's an origin to it, and the origin is there. So, but it came with all of the baggage. It came with all of the, you know, what I thought was, you know, sexist, racist language, couched in sort of more sophisticated terms. But when you parse it back, and then it came with something much scarier, which is this kind of, which I don't think you get at kind of a mainstream place, which is this messianic fervor. We're going to save the world. Which implies that people need saving, of course, which is something I only parsed many years later, like, what are we saving people from exactly? Right. I mean, from the choices, from the bad choices they've made.
Right. And we're going to be the agents of that message, right? Which is...
And it's only literally in the last 3 years, because it's funny, I keep rethinking this. When I started thinking about this Marxist discourse of false consciousness, that I realized that this entire movement to make Jews religious is based on a conception that they're all living lives of false consciousness, right? False consciousness being this notion that the choices you make, if they're not good for you, that even though you own those choices, you're making a mistake. Like this whole discourse in the Islamic world that when you know, women wear the hijab or the niqab, they're not really choosing it. They're really choosing it because they're victims of oppression, and they're really, you know, like somebody in South Africa who's, you know, black voting for apartheid, let's say, right? So the whole notion
and that's the attitude of these cure professionals too.
Exactly. Like, you made a choice to be secular. That's the wrong choice. You can't really mean that. You can't really mean you prefer that. You're just uneducated. You're sort of, so there's a patronization that comes with it, right? So we're not going to condemn you. We're going to pity you. We're going to say, if you really knew what your heritage was, you would choose it. In some cases, that's probably true.
Was that the argument people were making to you, or did you feel that you...
I think they kind of left me alone. It was, I saw it though continuously, that when they would speak to people, that would be the argument. The argument would be, you've got this proud heritage, you don't even know it. Implied, if you did know it, you would clearly choose to embrace it. And maybe that's true. In other words, it is true for a number of people. It's true for me, you know, so
that's what I'm kind of asking.
I can't deny it, but it's really not true for everybody. And I'm kind of thinking to myself now, why isn't it a rational choice to say, I'm really not interested in religion. I don't buy into God. I don't buy into the, you know, the notion that God left a text behind, or if you're a Christian, that God somehow became carnal flesh. Like, this is all absurd to me. I'm a decent human being. I want to do what I want to do. I believe in freedom. So, but those choices are assessed with either pity or they're seen as absurd.
That's just anxiety expressing itself in a different kind of way. I mean, we know that, right? I mean, I think the question is, And, you know, I always admire you because you're very much in the public sphere of the Jewish world, and I'm not so much now. I think it requires a certain kind of generosity. I mean, I think that's, if you're going to do anything in the Jewish world, it has to be out of generosity, meaning, and out of joy in a sense. And not the generosity which is self-interested, because much generosity is self-interested. You're talking about a very high level of kind of self-consciousness, meaning a person being able to say, there is this tradition. Again, I mean, as you say, even as I articulated, it starts to sound like an outreach message, right? But I think if you can communicate in this way, which is not about the anxiety of the person who is speaking, like I think about some of my old rabbis, and I can see in the end their basic message was, please be like me, right? Be like me, because if you are like me, especially me and you, right? If you are like me, wow, right? And that was always the implicit part whenever I learned in yeshivas here, yeshivot, right? You know, he's a professor and he learns here, right?
So it's self-validating.
It is. I mean, so that's why there's so much complicated. It's so complicated sociologically. Meaning, on the one hand, there's that sense of we really pity you. On the other hand, oh, the professor, right? So there's all sorts of kind of mixed feelings that inform that kind of attitude.
Right. So if we were nasty about it, we'd say it's hypocrisy, and if we were kind about it, we would say it's just embracing two different things.
I think being a Freudian always requires a certain kind of generosity, meaning, or not, meaning you see what informs people's motivations. I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's hard for me to think back. I remember one interchange I had with a person that I had a great deal of trust in, and I was very anxious at the time about our financial future. And I said, you know, what are my kids going to do in the future? Because of course the idea in the Haredi world then and still now is, you know, the men learn and really don't actually get any kind of education, and it's a very difficult life for the women. And he said his response to me was, "You'll provide for them." And I look at my salary now, and I'm a well-compensated professor at Bar Ilan, and the idea that I could actually do that, it was just such poor advice.
Yes.
Such bad advice. And I'm thinking back, I never called him and said, "You know, what were you actually thinking when you said that to me? I mean, at what cost, really, do you give that kind of advice to other people?" That's why I'm very, very, I think it says in the Mishnah, right, when you get wisdom at the age of 40, and you get eights at the power of giving advice at the age of 50. And I think the power of giving advice is that you don't feel the need to give advice. Meaning a person who doesn't feel the need to give advice, you can take advice from. But most people feel the need to give advice.
Right.
Right.
Right. I mean, you were talking about self-validation and mirroring. I think, did you feel mirrored in that world? See, when I think about myself, I couldn't find mirroring anywhere.
What do you mean by mirrored?
See, if we look at me, I bolted pretty quickly into a more modern community. And one of the things I've been struggling with, and this is for like decades now, is that I don't think of myself as a modern Orthodox Jew at all. Right. I don't really find myself reflected in those values. And with Jewish kind of category making, you've got to sort of supply people for the slot that you fit in. Now, I don't look Haredi, I don't have a beard, I don't dress that way, etc. So people automatically default, well, you're not Orthodox since you live this halachic life, so we're going to put you over here. And I think to myself, no, I think much of that is just phony. I don't really think that because you go to the movies and you have a job and you can refer off sports figures that makes you somehow modern. Like I find, sometimes I think about modern Orthodox and it's not modern enough, it's not Orthodox enough, it's not anything for me.
In many ways, the Haredi community here and also in America is progressive in its own way, much more than the modern Orthodox community is.
How do you mean?
Just in terms of dealing with financial realities. I mean, beginning to, right? Let's say Torah College as opposed to YU, meaning Torah was enabling people. They're not getting the kind of education that we had, and we could spend a lot of time talking about that and why that's very, very bad. But they are enabling the kind of financial goals of that community. I mean, I think there are some contexts within the ultra-Orthodox world in which there is a realization of what the issues are, financially at least, and how to deal with them. That's all I meant.
Right, I hear you.
I mean, not in any kind of intellectual or ideological sense. Obviously, it's backwards in that sense.
Right. Although I was brought up short many times by what seemed like real closed-mindedness in the modern Orthodox world. And I got fooled again and again. You look like you went to university. You look like, but actually your religious positions are so conventional, and I find it really hard to distinguish you from the people that you seem to purportedly snub. Right? There's this arrogance about the sort of ultra-Orthodox world. They're sort of backward and archaic. They're not sophisticated and modern like we are, and I really struggle to find exactly what is it about you, because you're Zionist, because your women learn some Torah Shabbat Peh, like what, where is it?
In certain institutional commitments. But I think what you're saying really is that part of not being that kind of person is having a certain kind of balance, forgive the term, in the soul, about being able to tolerate the different parts of who you are. I say to my writing students at Bar Ilan, I teach creative nonfiction, that if you're going to write memoir, you can't hate who you were in the past, because if you hate who you were in the past, you're going to end up writing either an apologetic narrative or an angry narrative. And I think we see people not only in the modern Orthodox world or the Haredi world, but also in the secular world, who cannot tolerate the dissonance in their own souls. And because they can't do that, they can't tolerate things outside of themselves, meaning there's a kind of parallel. So it's really the model of the individual that determines in a way the model of the community. That if we could have individuals that were more tolerant of who they are in all those aspects, then the communities would probably be more vibrant. Because when you're not tolerating that part in your own soul, it means there's a certain kind of dissonance, and that's usually projected outside against the other, whoever that other is. Right. I mean, I know tons of modern Orthodox people, even the way they treat Haredim, as you said, snub, like how can you be that? But listen, sociologists would tell us that there are certain things in common on all these kinds of communities, and we're just seeing them. Right?
No, I agree with you. My wife often uses the phrase tolerating ambivalence, right, as a kind of sign of emotional maturation.
But that's not something anybody can do in our communities.
Right.
Which is all we want, really.
Right. That's really what we want. Also, love. I was disappointed in what I see as the lack of love. There's a sternness that, and not on the individual level. I mean, there are some really wonderful, loving people. I think one of the things I enjoy the most about my life is just some of the people you meet and get to talk to, like we're talking here. But I can't for the life of me understand that. Like, why on your deathbed, are you happy that you made this kind of stern proclamation against people? Like, why wouldn't you want to be known for a more loving stance? I don't get that.
I would go back to the same model of the individual, that not only the relationship has to be one of tolerance, it really has to be one of love. I mean, the whole idea without going too far into it, the whole idea of tshuva, that the idea of tshuva out of love is greater than that out of fear. And I think that tshuva out of love is not only love for the divine, but love for the self. Meaning I can tolerate who I was in the past. Not only that, but I can embrace that past. It's really, I think that's what's motivated our conversation today, is the difficulty of doing that. Right? It's much easier in theory. I think people who are who have trauma, and we're obviously not talking about that, for them that's impossible. You can't go back. You can't incorporate that past. Right? But we're talking about, you said before, rupture, not trauma. Right?
We both like certain kinds of psychoanalytic writing. We both really like Adam Phillips. We both really like Jonathan Lear, especially you. And Lear talks about irony, not in the Seinfeld, we stand apart and sort of mock people kind of irony, but a deeper sense. Can you talk about what speaks to you about that?
I mean, you mentioned Phillips and Lear, so I think Adam Phillips, his conception of irony is much more a conception of an irony of standing, as you said, outside. Meaning, and that means I'm really not addressed by anything. And I think that's the weakness of Phillips's writings, maybe as a person, is that he feels that being addressed by any tradition or community, I think he thinks that's ultimately compromising in some kind of ineradicable way. Meaning, if you're addressed in that way, it's going to force you to become something who you don't want to be. Witness his review, if you've read it, of Weasel Tears Kaddish, right? Which is an extremely hostile review.
I didn't know that. That's really disappointing, actually.
Really, really hostile. And Lear, as you said, his conception of irony is really an internal kind of irony. That I can be inside, I can be in the world, I can make certain commitments, and I can see things. Let's keep up to think of very much like Shakespeare's As You Like It. I can see things really with two eyes, from two perspectives. think that's what Jews really do. I think even the Jews who are intolerant. I went to a Kiddush at shul last week, and every response that I elicit is an ironic response. I mean, Jews, somehow we are that way, right?
Right. I think I told you a story not long ago. I met this nonfiction editor in Canada, a very nice guy, very sort of classically Gentile in some ways, very sort of bland and polite and nice. Some of that's Canadian virtues, you know. But I was like, you know,
nice is a compliment.
Gently,
right?
Oh no, absolutely, absolutely. He was a wonderful person. Really, he was. You know, lived in the suburbs, and you know, even his hair was perfectly straight, and, you know. And in the course of the conversation, almost unwittingly, you know, some of my kind of sarcastic humor, just like certain kinds of jokes, and I saw that it wasn't that he didn't laugh, he didn't register. He didn't find them not funny. He just didn't even formulate them within the domain of a joke.
Right. So even the Jew at the Kiddush who's wearing the black hat and the black coat, and he's very much part of the Kiddush, he's able to make jokes that put him right outside of it. But it's being inside and outside at the same time.
Right.
And I think the other form of irony, the one of being outside, you lose a lot.
Yes.
Meaning you lose a lot of opportunities.
I agree. To me,
I mean, that's part of why we made this choice, I think, right?
I agree. No, there's a certain emotional cowardice. I never watched those shows. I wasn't a Seinfeld fan or a Simpsons fan, and because it doesn't resonate with me emotionally. I want to be moved. I want the laughter to emerge in some kind of absurdist way. You know, like Beckett makes me laugh, and actually Seinfeld doesn't make me laugh, which is odd in a way.
Very interesting.
But I agree with you. You know, I did want to ask you. I'm curious about like sort of major religious sort of structures for you, how they work. For instance, belief. Yeah. When you were becoming attracted to this way of life, we've talked about how we entered this life almost through action. We started learning, we started doing, we started keeping Shabbat. We moved. Right. Yeah. And the life of contemplation, though, did you ever get sort of frozen for a moment or stop and say, well, what do I really think about the underpinnings of Judaism or any Western faith, which is the divine being communication with human beings, giving a kind of plan for living that's obligatory, that you have to live, and all the attendant sort of baggage of like, you know, an afterlife, reward and punishment, the soul, like all of these metaphysical words. Did you find yourself when you were in your 20s and into your 30s, making a checklist for yourself of some kind? I believe in that, I don't believe in that, or it was always background noise for you?
For me, it was mostly background noise.
So you never really sat there and think, do I believe in God?
Right. I remember, somehow I'm thinking of T.S. Elliott and F.H. Bradley. Right, and T.S. Elliott, who wrote his dissertation on F.H. Bradley, says that reality is a convention, right? And I thought I was much more interested in exploring what that, or I really adhered to that.
What did that mean to you?
It meant that you didn't really have to worry so much about truth claims themselves, because you were much more interested in the cultural structures around them. Meaning, you know, the worst thing you could be called when you were in graduate school was an essentialist. Do you remember that? It's like being called a fundamentalist, right? Yeah. So saying reality is a convention, saying, well, I don't really believe that anything is essentially true. And I found that really, I think conceptions of truth, and for me, at least in the Jewish tradition, from that rabbinic point of view, are very, very different than they are in the Western ones. And I took comfort in that, and kind of, and in a way, I was able to bracket those questions, the ones that you're talking about. And the truth is, I guess I spent a lot of my life studying Christian theology, and I guess I think about a lot of those things indirectly through reading Paradise Lost, which is weird. I mean, a lot of Milton scholars do that. A lot of Milton scholars are Jewish. You go to these Milton conferences and you have all these Jews arguing about Christian theology. It's hilarious, really, because it's obviously a kind of sublimation, meaning we desperately want to talk about belief, but we can't, obviously, with our friends, you know, at a bar, because nobody really believes anything anymore. Milton did, you know.
Does it refract back on you in any kind of challenging way? I mean, Protestant theology is very faith-based. You're
Yeah.
talking about,
Right.
depending on the iteration, whether it's like, Schleiermacher here or Barth here, it's surrender. This is it. They're not even filtered so much through actions, works, and so on that we have in Judaism. So here you're sort of designating it as background noise, but intellectually you're facing it straight on. Like, how do you do that? Was that bothersome to you to hear all this talk about faith and God and belief? And surrender?
Because it was somebody else's faith.
Somebody else's faith, right? So you could.
And Milton is also a skeptic, as much as he's a crazy, fanatical, religious believer.
Yeah.
Right.
And it never came back to bite you. In other words,
no, of course. I mean, listen. I think God came back, right? I think it necessarily has to come back in your life at some point, and it's very difficult to think about the divine in conventional languages. I mean, if you picked up 20 books that Art Scroll published on it, you would think, that it was an easy question somehow. And our problem is, and being a Miltonist, my problem is you have very sophisticated ideas about the divine, the relationship between knowledge and the divine, the relationship between knowledge and belief. I mean, these are things that really.
Do you think we're too neck up?
What do you mean?
We're too in our heads, In other words, it's hard to just drop down and feel like you can. I'll tell you, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
There's a book I really like called When God Talks Back by a Stanford anthropologist named Tanya Luhrmann.
Okay.
So Luhrmann spent 4 years with this evangelical group, I think in California, called The Vineyard. And what's interesting about these people is they're not crazy. They don't see like sparks flying off of trees. They're like middle-class people. They have jobs. They have families. They believe God talks to them. And not in some kind of a grand revelatory way, but in a kind of let's have a cup of coffee with God kind of way. And they even talk about this. And so Luhrmann spent a lot of time with them, and they believe that it's perfectly reasonable to say that if there is a God, he wants to spend some time with you. What's the point of having a God who abandons you? In other words, their model is not Frankenstein, right? Their model is he's here and he wants to be in conversation with you, which frankly made a lot of sense to me. It's not something I buy into emotionally, but I heard it and I thought, I wonder why I can't be like that. Because I can't, right? I don't believe that. I don't believe like I sit at a table and put out a cup of coffee. And the image that she used was so striking. It was an image of a sonogram, like when you have your first baby and you go and you see this thing and you don't know what's going on the screen. The technician says, oh, no, it's right there. This little dot on the screen, that's your baby.
The heartbeat,
right? And so her image was that these Christians, for them, it was like you just have to learn how to read the screen. Like God talks to you, and there's a way of listening. There's a way of hearing the message kind of thing, right? So I couldn't buy into it, but I partly felt a bit rueful about that. And I felt like, am I too neck up in the way I think about my Judaism? How's that for you?
Listen, we're always going to be neck up in whatever we think about. That's unavoidable. But I think it's not, the question is where you put your feet. And for me, I feel I'm not really comfortable with God talking to me, but I feel that sense of being part of something historically significant, existentially significant. On Friday night at the Shabbos table with my family, especially in Israel, and I never advertise myself as a Zionist, probably, because we don't like the connotations of what that means or can mean for certain people. But I've been reading the book of the Maharal of Prague, Netzach Yisrael, which means, I guess, triumph of Israel, whatever, eternal Israel. And he just talks a lot about the relationship between Galut, being in exile, and redemption of some sort. And I know it's a kind of theodicy in a way, in the same way that Paradise Lost is a theodicy that is justifying the ways of God to man, justifying evil in the world. That for the Maharal, it's like, there's going to be Jewish history is characterized by a lot of suffering and a lot of bad things, and unfortunately, for a lot of people, their lives are also characterized by suffering. I mean, it's hard on the individual level. It might be very, very hard to take consolation in the Maharal's narrative that, it's going to all work out in the end. Although he's not really saying that. He's just saying that these two things, Galut and Geula, that they come together, that redemption and exile are kind of simultaneous terms. So I feel that I really do. Somebody asked me on some social media, do you think it's important to be in Israel to understand for your experience as a Jew? And I'm like, yeah, you know? I mean, just, it's a really powerful expression of the continuity of the Jewish people.
Right.
I mean, duh. I mean, I'm not saying just things that are obvious,
Yeah,
but I'm trying to
yeah.
talk about the way in which they resonate for me as kind of a faith
I hear.
in enhancing. It's not even an experience, it's like a phenomenology,
Yeah,
right?
it's very quiet for me. I mean, we're sitting here in my living room in Jerusalem, and
I'm almost betraying its quietness by talking about it with you.
yeah,
Right.
You know, it's and I don't actually. I almost feel like I'm outside my body when people say, "So you live in Israel? That must be like." And I think what they're saying every time they say that, I have visions of like the Kotel, the Wailing Wall, and jumping up and down, and I don't know, bullets flying, some sort of very extreme narrative, very dramatic narrative. And what's very striking to me about my life here is its non-drama. And I don't say that pejoratively, in a wonderful sense, right? Like just being here, walking the streets. I love the light. I like the way the light hits the stone. These things seem trivial, but for me, they're very powerful. Having conversations with people, a kind of freedom, what Israelis call zorem, like things just flow. With people, there's a kind of passion.
I might ask you about that. I mean, we in New York, I'm sure you were friendly with the guard at the Columbia Library or whatever library you went to.
No,
right?
but I'm from Toronto. That's a different kettle of fish. It's very repressed.
Right.
I love Canada. I'm still Canadian. I have a Canadian passport, and it's a very kind country in many ways. But there's a kind of repression there that's just unmistakable. There's a sense of my wife, who's American, likes to say that Canadians are friendly but not warm, and you never know what they're thinking. Right. That's what she says, and I think there's truth to that, and it's not I'm not knocking it. Like, I feel great gratitude to the place, but when you talk about being in Israel, like for me, that's part of it, is this sense of flow and passion, and destiny. I mean, almost as I said, the difference between Israel and the diaspora is the difference between being in the bleachers and being on the field. There is something about being on the field here that's undeniable. Having said that, I'm not particularly comfortable with these elevated discourse of redemption and the redemption is coming.
No, I don't want to sound messianic. What I really mean is, going back to literary criticism, Frank Kermode wrote this book in 1967, The Sense of an Ending, and he talks about the way in which time is structured. Tick, tock, right? And I find that, so tick is the beginning, tock is the redemption, and we're in the interval in the middle.
Right.
And just being in the middle is made more meaningful by having a knowledge that there is that tock that's coming, right? It's not coming tomorrow necessarily. Right. We hope it does, right? But
what do you think the talk looks like?
I don't know. It's none of my business at the moment, right? I mean, that kind of metaphysical speculation doesn't interest me at all, because that to me seems to me that when that happens, well, then it has very nasty political consequences.
Yes, it does. Right? It does.
Right.
And
when we give our own end visions and say that should inform current political discourse, that's a problem.
Right. You've written about this. I think you find some of the politics here very distressing on that level.
Yeah, I'm an American, so I believe in separation of church and state as a kind of ideal, not as a b'diavad, not that something comes after the fact.
Yeah.
When the Messiah comes, whenever that may be, then it will be different. But at the moment, that I really do think is the ideal here, and I think we've talked about this. The nation-state bill is just an example of trying to not only politicize, not only to make the political sphere religious, but injecting it with a certain kind of messianic value, which is really a problem. Yeah.
Can you tell me about what it was like with your kids through the years? You've written rather movingly about the fact that you tried to create a certain kind of religious vision at home, and in some ways it didn't work, and even so, it took.
Right.
Can you explain to me the irony of that what you actually tried to accomplish didn't work, but the outcome, almost in a utilitarian sense, worked on that level? You have really nice children, and they got married, and they maintained, religious lives. And how do you think that process?
I don't know. I mean, I think maybe you have this experience as well, that my children now are living in a world which is the consequence of the decisions I made 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So that's hard. And I think each one of my children, you can kind of mark their development in relationship to the institutions that represent that choice that we made 20 years ago.
Yes.
My oldest went to extremely religious schools, somehow survived them, you know. And now my youngest is in a different, social context. But all along the way, there's a kind of continuum of the kinds of choices they had to make to just stay,
Has there been a questioning? Did they ever say to you, Abba, like, why'd you put me in that school?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And what'd you answer them?
I had a good answer a couple of weeks ago, or about a month ago. No, it's. I feel guilty. I think that's part of one of the difficulties of embracing that narrative. Although, having said that, we have helped our children, move in the system and out of the system. So they're all either in school, with jobs, whatever, right? I saw the Nesiva Shalom, which I guess is this Hasidic sefer.
The Slonim Rebbe.
The Slonim Rebbe.
Yeah.
And I don't remember all of the details, but he said that when a person does tshuva, I think he might have compared it to Reish Lakish, the Talmudic sage who jumped across the river, and that was where he was Choser b'tshuva, and then afterwards he was weaker in the river that he could conventionally or habitually jump over. He fell into the middle of it. And I think he says something to the effect of, when a person makes a radical change in their life, there's going to be collateral damage. My kids were like, great, but it was necessary in a way. I mean, I'm not saying that the pain or difficulty or challenges that they endure now are necessary, but they were a necessary consequence of what we did. They were an unintended consequence of what we did. And as we talked about earlier, part of living Jewishly now for us has kind of been to try to pull back without pulling everything back.
What interests you Jewishly now?
What interests me Jewishly now? Learning with my son, which I get pleasure out of, my 13-year-old son. I also listen. I like learning new. I'm learning the Nesiva Shalom on the Parsha. I like to move through different perspectives. I mean, it's strange because in the Jewish world now, I had an experience with my son-in-law. I hope you're not watching this, in which I was explaining a certain perspective, and he said, "I don't hold like that." And I said, "I don't really care if you hold like that." And to me, part of the joy is understanding.
Yeah.
What joy do I get in Judaism? Seeing how interpretations develop.
Right.
Understanding how they're justified. I find always a certain beauty in that. And even in the end, though I might find one more compelling than another, anything that can be built in this compelling manner is very beautiful to me. I love it. I just love learning like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. That was that was just romantic for me from the start, is the notion of all of these differences. Oddly, I still love learning Talmud, and the reason is because of that. Just that variety of difference, which I don't find actually mirrored.
No, not at all.
In Jewish life,
right?
Like Jewish religious life, which is monochromatic if they could get their way.
No, it's amazing really, because Talmudic learning implies a certain kind of empathy in a way. Why is this Tana, this Talmudic sage, this Amora, seeing things in this manner? Right? Why is that?
Yeah.
And that requires an active kind of empathy.
Yeah.
Right. And then to be able to say, oh, and this other person has a perspective as well.
Right.
Really, that's when the Gemara says these and these are the words of the living God, and we ultimately determine according to Beit Hillel, because he was tolerant and forbearing, and I understand that is he allowed himself to be empathetic to the other perspective, maybe in ways that Beit Shammai didn't.
Yeah.
Right.
And the irony being that in contemporary Orthodox discourse, we banished that.
And also, these guys are learning 12 hours a day.
Right.
They're sitting.
What are they getting from that? Don't they realize this is the model here is of exchange, debate, the difference, the other?
What happened is, and I understand this well, is that in the Brisker world, the Brisk family, which goes back to Chaim of Volozhin and through the Soloveitchiks, is in the 19th century, there began to be a tremendous awareness of what was happening in the sciences and in philosophy. And there is the incorporation of certain kind of logical models from those worlds. So they begin to embrace the absolute truth of those traditions, which are foreign to our own tradition.
Right.
So the issue becomes then, what is the truth? Which is not a question that we really should be asking. My son-in-law actually learns with Rav Chaim Zimmerman, who is really kind of the extreme version of that, this bringing in the categories of logic into Torah learning. And not that Torah learning is not logical without it, but I mean like very formalized logical structures. Which, and in a way, I would see it as just dealing with a certain kind of anxiety about the modern world. So let's take the most advanced philosophical discourse of the modern world and say the Torah is that, right?
Right. You know, I mean, that goes back, of course. Maimonides looked at Aristotle and said, Torah's that, you know? So it's not unknown. You have a little bit of a fascination with Rabbi Soloveitchik, I think. You know, you've obviously written your book, The Last Rabbi. It's a very different kind of book on Rabbi Soloveitchik. It brings in, it's interesting, you're talking about bringing in discourses. You bring in a lot of different kinds of discourses. What interested you about him that motivated you to write about him at length?
And really autobiographically, the first exposure to a sophisticated philosophical Jewish discourse was reading Halachic Man and Halachic Mind. It was like, oh, right? Meaning I wanted to discount Judaism as a backward, primitive, non-intellectual movement. And when I read this, you know, this is happening at the same time that I have a friend who's starting to learn and he wants to bring us into it, and we're going to a beginner's minyan. And then reading Rav Soloveitchik was like, wow, so there's intellectual content here as well.
Yeah.
Wow, right? And he was very helpful to me in thinking about a lot of the issues that we've been speaking about now, about certain kinds of pluralism, although ultimately I don't think Rav Soloveitchik was a pluralist in the sense that you and I are talking about it. In a way, my Jewish life was determined by reading his work and studying in some sense with his students.
And what troubles you about his thought?
You know, I'm not really troubled by his thought. I mean, that seems to be like, I've noted that my book came out 2 years ago and has not been reviewed by a single one of his students, which is odd.
Why do you think that is?
I think because they have the same assumptions maybe that I'm assuming about your question, though probably I'm assuming wrongly, that being critical means being troubled means rejecting them. I mean, some of the chapters of the book that I wrote are as if I'm sitting in his Gemara shir. I mean, I'm not writing about Gemara, but sitting at his feet and really explaining his thought in ways that I think he would not only approve of, but would be enthusiastic about and say, oh, finally somebody's got it, right?
That's interesting.
Because you have to read all this stuff, which none of my students have read, and you've actually read them.
Yeah.
So, you know, we talk about in the university the hermeneutics of suspicion or the hermeneutics of empathy, having an interpretive perspective that's informed either by empathy or by suspicion. So half of the book, at least, is empathy.
Yeah.
But the other half of the book is saying, wait, you know, there's a critical perspective by which you can look at his work, just like I would look at other thinkers who I revere, like Shakespeare, like Milton, right? But I think there are certain parts of Rav Soloveitchik's languages or commitments that he's not, and this is, I guess, where I get into trouble, is he's unaware of certain of the issues that inform his work.
Yeah.
Right. And that nobody likes to hear that.
Right.
Meaning, especially when you use kind of Freudian languages.
Yes.
A friend of mine told me that he's a YU rabbi, and I said to him, you know, I found it strange that nobody had reviewed my book, and I asked him if he knew if there was an unofficial fatwa out on The Last Rabbi. So he said, to be honest with you, you know, if people understand it or not, it really doesn't speak to them. And I said back to him, you know, I didn't write a sermon.
Yeah.
It's an argument. And I would think that people in that world would want to engage with the argument. Argue with me, right? Do that.
Right.
And that's really why I do think there might actually be some kind of unofficial fatwa, because the Soloveitchik family is very powerful in terms of what gets circulated of his work. Whatever. I mean, it could be just being paranoid, but they don't really like to tolerate any kind of critical discourse, and the absence of the engagement with the argument that I made is just striking to me. Mm-hmm. Meaning, well, let's have that intellectual openness. You know, take me down, show me I'm wrong,
right?
Or you know, or let's just be in a conversation together.
I mean, I found that in my professional life for the last 17 years. I've been carrying on Jewish conversations, and the hardest part about doing them is actually getting them done, because nobody wants to talk to anybody. Nobody wants to talk to anybody unless they completely mirror what they think already, in which case it's going to be an awfully dull conversation.
Well, there's also, I mean, what you do, there's inevitably, and maybe this also, a performative aspect to what you do, meaning people come, there's a camera, there's an audience, and very often in the panels you ran for Torah in Motion, they were representing a institutional perspective, right? So they're already constrained.
Yes, I learned that too late. Yeah.
I think it's a good thing to try to start. I mean, I've never had an institutional platform because I always feel very uncomfortable with that.
Right. Those people are usually far more productive to talk to because they're not gravitating immediately towards safety and the fear that they'll somehow betray their institutional allegiances. But I don't think it's just that. I think it's also that we're out of practice. People are so uncomfortable just expressing themselves in terms of tolerating the other, being in front of the other.
Well, there's an absence of love, and the question is, where do you find those communities of love? And I guess the real question is, can you find them outside of your family? Because love is really often an excuse to tell people what to do, right? As you were saying before, the Kiruv rabbi, I love you so much that I'm going to tell you that you have to change your life in this, and this way.
Right.
And what happens in the political sphere as well is informed by that false kind of love. We want, and that's why bringing religion to the public sphere is so dangerous, because it comes in as this agent of charity and generosity, when very often it's hiding something else, or being motivated by something else.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
I want to finish by talking about Milton.
Oh, good.
Tell me something powerful for you that you learned from Milton.
Something I learned from Milton. I should write a book about this.
Yes,
six things that I learned from Milton.
That would actually get a major publishing contract. That title, really. Okay. It's about self-help,
Pretty much everything that I've ever written in any field, and since I've talked about hybrid personalities before, I've written in lots of different fields, have all been informed by an article, the first article that I wrote when I was in graduate school, which was on Milton's political tract written in 1644 called Areopagitica. And Areopagitica was a tract against licensing. The practice of licensing was something that the kings and queens had done for generations, which was mandating that anybody, before they published a text, would have to go to the licensor and would have to get the official stamp of approval, pre-publication censorship. So the English Revolution is successful. Milton comes, the radicals come into power, and they maintain the licensing office.
That's interesting.
So Milton writes against this. And he essentially argues for a community which is not afraid of diversity. And he tries to balance, and he does for that one magical moment in Areopagitica, the constraints of community and the freedom of difference and individuality. It's an extraordinary work.
That is extraordinary. It's like The Who, right?
Like
meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right?
Right. He has this wonderful trope at the end. He speaks about different parts of the people of England. I was about to say people of Israel. For him, for Milton, it's the same. He uses the trope of brotherly dissimilitudes, which contains both difference and similarity.
Unity,
Similarity, similitudes, brotherly similarity, dissimilitudes. It's a great kind of Miltonic trope, distilling both of those things, which in a way is, I think, what we're kind of wanting, the respect for the other, but also in a context of love, community. But I think that's it's hard to do that without going to places you don't want to go, politically.
Thanks very much.
Great.